Hello everyone. I recently posted this page I completed from Johanna Basford's Lost Ocean book into a couple adult coloring groups I belong to on Facebook. I had a lot of people ask me how I did the shading behind the shells to make them pop out so much, and how I went about my background, especially getting the foamy effect that I managed to achieve for the water. So I quickly colored up a page that also has shells on it for this tutorial. And this is from Splash of Color Creative Expression Coloring Magazine. So we will dive into the first part of the background, pun intended. For that, I used pastels. I used a couple chalk pastels I got from the dollar store. I paid $1.25 for them, and despite the price, they're actually very good pastels. And then I used my Daler Rowney soft pastels. I can't remember exactly how much I paid for those. I think somewhere between $12 and $15. The price may seem a little steep, but they will last probably a very long time. As it is, I've already had them for a year. You can use any kind and brand of pastel that you want. Just make sure that you test out the color you plan to use on a piece of paper first, because as you can see, the color that I picked out looks to be a very ugly yellow and not a very pretty sand color. But you'll see when I start laying it down on the page, it actually has a little bit more of a brownie shade to it than the pastel shows. Now I'm using a Q-tip for this technique because I find that it lays down the pigment a little bit darker than a cotton ball, but you can use whatever you'd like. Right now I'm just creating the line where the ocean will meet the sand. Now you don't want this to be perfectly straight across your page. You want it to be uneven, you want it to curve up, curve down, just anything to make it look a little bit more imperfect, which will make it look more natural. Another thing you'll notice in this video is that it cuts off shortly after I get into doing like maybe a third of the sand. And this is because my phone decided it didn't have enough space for the video, and so it couldn't properly save it. So I will try to do my best to explain what you missed. After I finished coloring the sand here, using the Q-tip, I picked up a little bit of my brown Daler Rowney pastel, but instead of blushing it onto the page, I just dabbed it to loosen the pigment off onto the page. And I did that just everywhere until I was satisfied with it. And then I lightly rubbed it in. Don't go too much, you can always add more, but you can't really take the pastel off. After that, I used my light blue chalk pastel, and I just did the water with that, and then just to create some depth into the water to make it look like the water was getting deeper as you go further into the ocean, I used a darker blue pastel. And here you can see that's all done. So the blue near the sand is a little bit lighter than the blue near the edge of the page. Right here I'm doing the shadows of the shells. Unfortunately, they already had gray outlines for the shadows on this page. I wish they didn't, but they did. The colors that I used to define those shadows, though, they're all Crayola pencils that I used. I used True Blue for the lightest blue and Navy Blue for the darkest blue. And what I did was I just went over the shadow that they already had with the True Blue and kind of extended it out a little bit into the water and faded it in to match the color. And then I went with the Navy Blue and made it darker right under the shell and lightened that out into the True Blue. I did the same thing with the shells on the sand. I used light brown and dark brown for that, and I used the exact same technique. These shells that are half in the water and half in the sand, I used the same technique, except I dragged a little bit of each color in, on the sand, I dragged it into the water a little bit, and in the water, I dragged the color into the sand a little bit and just kind of faded it out as I went, just to kind of mix the two. But you don't really have to do that because the foam will cover that. Now here's some examples and a little bit of practicing I did. There's the technique that we're going to use for the foam. So you see when you push the brush down, it actually kind of glides out and gives it like an octopus type look. And for this, I find it's way better to use a plastic bristled brush because it can handle the abuse a little bit more, and definitely use a brush that you don't plan on, using for anything but maybe this and other messy techniques. I also experimented with different paint consistency. That top one there was paint mixed with water, and the bottom one was just normal paint. And then the other piece of black paper I was practicing doing the waves on. I'm using Crafter's Choice acrylic paint, and I actually got that from the dollar store too, and I really don't mind that. And then here we'll grab our brush that's already taken quite a bit of abuse from my Lost Ocean page. And you want to dip that into your paint and then just get rid of some of the paint by practicing that technique and starting to deform your brush a little bit. I decided to go with less paint and just slightly build up and add to it until I was happy with it. Because, again, like I always say, you can add more, but you cannot take it away. One good thing about acrylic paint, though, is if you get it in a spot where you don't necessarily want it, you can just wipe it off quickly before it dries, which is a nice option to have. Now we're just going along that line where the water meets the sand, and we'll just slightly dab the paint in there. And where the shells are, where you can't necessarily see that line, you'll just have to make up your own line. Now, I went down a little bit here because I wanted the center of that unique looking shell to show above the foam. And unfortunately, this resulted in pretty much the whole shell in the water part to be covered up with foam, but it actually turned out okay. So we'll just continue doing this and we'll keep adding it until we're happy with it. And here I am thickening the lines a little bit because you don't want the foam to be the same width all the way through the page. In nature, some of the foam's a little bit thicker, some of it's thinner, some of it you can barely even see. So again, just make everything not symmetrical and not perfect, and it will look extremely natural. And trust me, that's hard for me to do because I am a perfectionist, so I'm sure that you can come across with probably a better look than I could even if you're not a perfectionist. So now we'll get to the foamy parts that crash against the shells as the waves come in. You'll see I'm using the same up and down method I was using for the foam. I decided after doing this shell that it worked quite a bit better now that the brush was already fairly wrecked to slant it down on its side a little bit and add the foam in that way. You'll see with this red shell that I do next that I start taking on that technique, and it looks a little bit better. Okay, now that we've got the foamy parts done, we'll move on to the waves. And for that, I used a very thin-edged brush. And what we're going to do is we're just going to dip that brush in the paint, and we're going to dab off a little bit of the paint, practicing the technique we're going to use, which is basically just pressing the brush to the paper, except instead of moving down vertically, we're going to go across horizontally. So as you can see, we just dab it on the paper very lightly, just adding more as we go. And you'll also see that I add in another technique where I will put a little bit more paint on my brush, and I will press the brush onto the page and swiftly swipe it either left or right, just to create a little bit of a more defined edge. This technique makes the bristles on the brush fan out just a little bit, so that way those waves start off thin and then they go a little bit thicker. It just makes it look a little bit more realistic, I thought. And there was no method to this. I just added lines in where I thought that they should go, and I just kept going until I was happy with it. When you're done, it should look something like this. I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and I can't wait to see your guys' pages using the knowledge you learned from this tutorial. I hope you're enjoying any coloring you're currently working on, and have a blessed day. Thanks for watching.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
At the end of every week, each one of us becomes a freak. Tonight the DJ makes us move until the sweat drops from the roof. It's time to let the best beat hard, so now we don't stand out apart. Just take it there, you're